Based in Larkspur, California, Stephen A. Nielsen is a U.S. registered patent attorney with many years of experience in patent procurement and in achieving favorable results in federal court in the field of intellectual property litigation. Mr. Nielsen is the past chairperson of the intellectual property section of the Marin County Bar Association. Mr. Nielsen received his JD in 1987 from Bolt Hall, University of California at Berkeley, and also holds a BA in computer science. He may be contacted at steve@nielsenpatents.com, on his website, nielsenpatents.com, or via his LinkedIn page.
Thank you, Robert, for that very kind and generous introduction. It's always a pleasure to work with your organization, Center for Continuing Education. And it's an honor to have everyone here at the presentation. My name, again, is Steve Nielsen. I'm easy to reach. If you Google Marin County Patent Attorney, my website will come up. I'm also on LinkedIn, and my phone number and other contact information are on the slide. And I do make a reasonable effort to respond to all of the inquiries, all of the compliments, and especially all of the criticisms. And I enjoy engaging with each and all of the participants. And I appreciate everyone's point of view. And hopefully this is deemed a safe place for everyone to express their points of view, whether it's my professional presentation or anything personal regarding my ethnicity. In presenting this, all of your comments are welcomed, and I will respond. About 16 years ago, I started presenting CLE courses in the areas of patent law and intellectual property, and I really enjoyed presenting my interpretations of the subject matter. I did videos on design patents, patent drawings, utility patents, searches for prior art, ethics for patent attorneys, and other areas, and a bit of trademarks as well, and other areas. And I enjoyed the presentations, and I had sort of a rubric or methodology of Robert would present a subject that might be of interest, and I would study the heck out of it, organize notes, and present it like another day in the office. And all went very well. It continues to go well in that regard. So I view myself as someone who, like any normal patent attorney, gathers information, does a search, thinks about it, and tries to present it in a coherent manner, keeping ideas of relevance to the user, keeping in mind the requirements of the various states that require certain subjects to be addressed, and within the time allotted as well. About 8 years ago, Robert and CCEC got wind of a new mandatory subject in Illinois and New York. It dealt with discrimination, bias, etc. It was a rather vague description about 8 years ago, mostly dealing with just the general idea of discrimination and how that affects people's trust in the legal system, how that affects lawyers working their way up through, say, a large firm. And it was really an interesting new requirement. And I have to give credit to Illinois and New York for being first, and credit to Bob, who presents video packages to every state. And he saw this and thought, here's a new subject. There were no templates at the time or prior presentations to view. And I was honored that he approached me to say, Steve, you seem to be fairly competent at gathering raw data and figuring it out. Would you be interested in taking this on? And I was intrigued. And I said, yes, I'd love to. And I've had no regrets. It's been a really interesting journey seeing this subject evolve over the 8 years. I also enjoy seeing other presentations done and getting different points of view on something that to me is much larger than law firm management or the practice of law. It deals with our humanity and us as a people as a whole. It also is interesting in that it's a study of group behavior. as a framework for viewing how groups get along. And one of my favorite quotes is there's no I in team, and that we get more done in teams of people. So this study revolves around the idea of this particular video of implicit bias or hidden bias in individuals and in groups. And I'm even so bold as to talk about, where does this come from? Why do we have biases or prejudices that we either know of or don't know about? What is sort of the genetic fabric? What has sort of happened with the evolution of humanity to make this happen? And not a lot of people are willing to go there, but I enjoy it because there's a lot of good science on the subject that predates this whole CLE requirement of 8 years ago. In my earlier videos, I really focused on those earlier studies of humanity and the ascent of man in books of that I learned back in college when I studied humanities. So at a certain level, I'm intrigued by this. I see the bigger issue and bigger meaning of dealing with us as a people. But at the end of the day, I analyze and present the information. It's another day in the office for me without regard to my own ethnicity. So that's my approach. And I appreciate everybody being here and listening to this. As I mentioned before, over the past 8 years, I've enjoyed watching this subject grow into more subtle nuances of definitions, calls of action, and observation of the human condition. It's sort of become, a lot of people have sort of joined the bandwagon and presented these, and everybody has a little different view. At least I hope everybody has a little different view, because it's no fun to buy the same video every year, hear the same thing, or buy the video from someone else and hear the same thing. So on this 9th year of my journey in presenting this, this program pays special attention to a new requirement by the State Bar of California that has a specific focus on implicit bias. Implicit bias is a subfield credit in the general credit category of bias or discrimination, and both credits are required by the State Bar of California. Looking at the State Bar of California, and the other states mirror this or will mirror this subcredit field. Activities that qualify to satisfy this subcredit field include courses with a focus on implicit bias and the promotion of bias-reducing strategies to address how unintended biases regarding race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and other characteristics undermine confidence in the legal system. That's a mouthful. I think that's a great rubric to use because it's focused on us as lawyers. How do we get some confidence back in our once proud legal system? And what's interesting as attorneys is that we may be the only contact a great number of people have with the legal system, other than maybe police. So it's important for us to present ourselves with competence and integrity and knowledge and sensitivity toward the needs of others and our own known and unknown biases or preconceived notions. The State Bar has further course criteria, number 3 of which is the training shall include a component regarding the impact of implicit bias, explicit bias, and systematic bias on the legal system, and the effect this can have on people accessing and interacting with the legal system. Number 4 is the training shall include actionable steps. Licensees, and that's us, practicing attorneys, members of the bar, including actionable steps that we can organize, recognize, and address to deal with our own unknown implicit biases. Let's start with an initial discussion of biases. The research performed, and let me just stop there and give an embarrassing shout out to Robert Mazzell, the owner and founder of CCE. In fairness to him, as a matter of full disclosure, he has gathered the lion's share of raw data and information for this presentation and all my prior presentations on this subject. His research is tenacious and year-round. Throughout the year, I'll get randomly sequenced emails. He'll find an interesting article, have an interesting idea, and then I put them in a folder on my computer or subfolder for the next year's presentation. So he's taken the laboring oar and presenting or finding what's hot and what's not and what's interesting in this evolving field. And I'm considering him an expert in the field for his gathering of the raw data. So this course today reflects and indicates the scope and variety of opinions, studies, and importance that have continued to grow in this area. We talk about the number of biases, implicit and otherwise, and the number is extensive, and we can't fully examine all of the biases or even address them, identify them in a 1-hour program. But hopefully this program leaves you with a sort of a general framework to view it. And hopefully, as we'll get into, why does this occur? Because to me, if you know why something's going on, you're able to remember things better. Just as in law school, if you know the reason for a law or a rule, you remember the rule. So if we can talk about why we have biases, where does it come from? It makes things easier to remember. And it also takes away some of the shame that some of us may inflict upon ourselves for having preconceived ideas that we express outwardly or that we find inwardly that we don't even realize until we really examine ourselves. So I'm going to attempt to present a number of key biases and examine how they impact the legal profession with respect to both large firms, medium-sized firms, small firms, and as well as individual lawyers who are solo practitioners. I believe many people in law are solo practitioners or associate with 2 or 3 attorneys. I think that's 80% of the practice. The law, while big law gets most of the press, they comprise just a small number of the numbers in our profession. I hope this program can be useful in your everyday practices, increase awareness of our own biases, and offer ideas that can benefit all of us. Definitions of bias or biases. There's an excellent summary written by Malcolm Gladwell in Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking, found at this hyperlink on this slide here. And if you want further information, I would encourage you to go to that slide to go more in depth. But in the due to the constraints of time, I'm going to give my summaries here. So let's talk about what is bias, definitions of bias. What is implicit bias or unconscious bias? The state of the art says that it may refer to the various social stereotypes and judgments that people unknowingly assign to others based on a variety of factors, such as their age, socioeconomic status, weight, gender, race, or sexual orientation. And while these bases aren't always negative, they're shaped, in my opinion, by a survival instinct that causes people to associate with people who they perceive to be similar to themselves because they're deemed to be safe. And that's Gladwell with the site there added. But I have my own ideas of evolution and why and I like this because it's sort of, maybe I have a, what's the word, a bias, a affirmation bias. When I see things that affirm what I believe, I'm drawn to them. So I could be guilty here of an affirmation bias by being drawn to someone else's work that coincides to what I've been talking about for over the last 8 or 9 years is that our survival instinct causes us to associate people who perceive to be similar to ourselves. Here's a slide that I've had, I think, for the last 8 or 9 years. And it goes back to Bernowski's book that I mentioned before of the evolution of man, or it's also called the ascent of man. And I studied this back in 1980 when I was an undergrad, and I really enjoyed the scientific approach to how we evolved in groups and what we did to survive, or what we think people did to survive back in the Stone Age. So Gladwell's definition resonates with me and asks the question, how did we survive in the past? And there's a theory that we quickly surmise people as being a fellow tribes person, as being a friend or a foe. Are they familiar? If they aren't familiar, then in our lower brains, our DNA would say, okay, spindly feeling, let's be very cautious. And this might have worked a million years ago, but today it does hinder us. And getting back to our evolution, we'd ask, is this person in my group? And back in the day during our ascent from the Stone Age to here, even going back further, we needed to make a quick decision. Friend or foe, fight or flight. And here I like the slide of somebody carrying a spear, either looking at an unknown animal or unknown person, something that is different. And I think this is all in us, because if you look at our current humanity, it was only 10,000 years ago that we evolved from hunter-gatherers to storing grain, raising livestock, and being more stationary. So our brains and our bodies have not really adapted well to this new modern life where we're sitting all day. And I always talk about how sitting is the new smoking. And so our DNA, we can't expect it to change on a dime in the last 10,000 years. So I think it's okay that we acknowledge how we evolved and how our brains evolved to get us to survive through our evolutionary process. And so I asked the question, this is, I think, where a lot of our implicit bias happens. Sometimes if you're looking over a high bridge or something and your heart pounds, and that's your lower brain saying, danger, danger, you could die here if you fall. And I think that was under Darwinism, which is about reproduction of the fittest. If you didn't develop that spindly sense of that lower brain mechanism, you wouldn't produce. And so you didn't carry people who had that feeling would reproduce. And hence we're now stuck with a lot of mechanisms that worked well thousands of years ago, but don't really serve us so well today. So the question I ask, we developed a survival instinct that arguably no longer serves us. Going back to our DNA, the advantages of being in a group through our evolutionary process included efficiencies in hunting, gathering, and child rearing. I mean, back in the day, it literally took a village. Companionship and emotional support, something that I think all of us need today. It's an idea not to be dismissed, because it was difficult to survive alone in the Stone Age, just as it's been sort of difficult to live in isolation through our couple of years of COVID here. So there are similarities that are interesting. And thus we have evolved into social animals, never mind social media. And there's an idea that no person is an island. And thus we have developed an affinity bias, which means to feel comfortable with those to be perceived as similar. And I think this affinity bias is understandable. And so we shouldn't blame or shame ourselves or blame others who may start out with an affinity bias or a hidden bias to feel comfortable with those who they perceive as being similar to themselves. So To me, this is where it all starts. I like to start here. And if anyone has different ideas, please send me an email. I'd love to hear it. But from my reading, this seems to be the current state of the art as to our human evolution, um, the genetics that we've passed on over millennium, and just sort of, this awkward mechanics that we have physically and mentally, that did well or survived somehow in the Stone Age and is somewhat surviving. Now we're in our um, past the hunter-gatherer, we're now in the agricultural age. And then, of course, we've gone from the industrial age to our current informational age, which many of us are not well equipped. So we're society, and our ability to make tools and do things has really outstripped our physiological abilities. So it's important that we address our implicit or hidden bias. The good news is that us people we're smart and we're adaptable, and we can really change the hardwiring of our brain. There's a wonderful book by Rick Hansen to that effect. Just by thinking about things, taking action, being aware, and being mindful, we can really make ourselves better adapted for this modern society, this informational age. And that includes, as a subset, examining and diffusing our implicit or hidden or unknown biases against others who we perceive as not being similar to ourselves. Types of implicit or unconscious bias, and these are sort of the highlights that I've put together, and of course this list could be endless, include weight bias. Think about also how that's evolved over the years. If you look at European art, heavier models were preferred over thinner ones, and that sort of fluctuates. Name bias as indicating an ethnicity. Some of us have bias in that. And then also perceived beauty bias is something that I think is very real and is often exemplified and exacerbated by social media. And then, of course, we have race and ethnicity bias. We'll talk about that. Gender bias and age bias, which to me is uniquely interesting because unless we expire, we're all going to face that. And then we have our LGBT plus bias and community bias, something that's been well documented and is very newsworthy today. And I think we are making great progress there. And then, as just an obscure one, I've added height bias. It's not a protected class, but it's very interesting to me because it's something that people are doing something physically about. To get sidetracked for a second here, it's mostly men, and short men in our society have certain biases against them. And many men find this so severe that they're spending upwards of $70,000 in uninsured medical expenses to have literally both of their femurs broken, pins put in, an agonizing recovery period to gain 3 or so inches of height. So to me, this is relevant because it really talks about the agony that certain people feel from something that seems very innocuous, such as height bias. And so to me, the study of height bias and broken legs helps me be sensitive to these other biases and how people can feel very strongly about them and how they can feel they're truly affected by them. Further types of implicit or unconscious bias that I think are worth discussing are ability bias. It's perceived differences in physical or mental or emotional ability. Perceived socioeconomic status. When we see someone dressed in a shovelly manner, I think our brain can go to different places. And what's interesting, sometimes very wealthy people don't bother to dress well because maybe they don't need to or feel that they have to. And also another one is priming bias. to be unduly influenced by the first exposure or a conclusion or idea. And this comes into play in jury instructions. Whenever I get lost, I used to do a lot of litigation. Whenever I would just kind of get confused or just lost in all the evidence, all the witness statements, all the deposition transcripts, what's relevant, what isn't, I always went to the jury instructions. Because to me, those are wonderful summaries of the law. And one of my favorite jury instruction is to ask jurors to withhold judgment, to not talk amongst themselves until all the evidence is presented. And then in jury deliberations, to listen to all 12 points of view. Because to me, that's one of the big values of a jury system. 12 people get to give their own point of view. And so I think our legal system at the jury trial level does acknowledge a priming bias to be unduly influenced by the first exposure, asking jurors to withhold judgment, listen to all the points of view. And to me, this is really interesting. It's one I hadn't thought of before doing this year's presentation on this. And so I'm keeping this in mind in my own life. It's the first time I hear about it. I'm not going to give it an undue amount of weight. The requirement for California in this sub credit system also requires a study of explicit bias, which is often defined as a conscious bias or prejudging and is often expressed openly. So what's a good example of this? And this is what I've heard myself from colleagues in various professions, not necessarily so much in the law business, but other businesses, is I hear people of my demographic saying, I want my young son or daughter, or I want a young person to run my social media campaign. The openly expressed bias is that young people are considered digital natives and will be better suited than older digital immigrants, which to me means our kids grow up with cell phones and laptops and tablets way too early, and they become digital natives. They grow up with it, and studies have shown it does change their brain. We don't know if it's good or bad, but you can do an MRI and see the young mind is changed by the digital tablets versus our day when we would actually read books or go out and play outside. So there's a explicit bias or known bias expressed openly that younger people are better to run a social media campaign. And as we're going to get into later in this presentation, I'm going to challenge people to think, well, older people, and in my later slides where I talk about what older people can do to shrug off or minimize the bias, either open or hidden against them, is to learn new skills and to beat the younger people at their own game of being digitally competent. So I think this is a great example of explicit or openly expressed and known bias. And to me, a bias is a prejudging of a person's ability without judging that person. And also what's interesting when you look at jury instructions, it talks about avoid preconceived notions. But at the end of the day, a jury is encouraged, and in fact required, they don't go home until they do, to make judgments on questions of fact with respect to the particular individual or individuals or transactions involved. So prejudice means to judge without the understanding the facts, but yet at the end of the day, we do need to make judgment decisions. And looking at our judicial system, that's done after we study facts particular to the individual in the particular case. And I think that's an important thing to ponder. And a lot of you litigators are hopefully going to think about the jury instructions, because to me, they help me make sense of how we make bias work and ameliorate it in our legal system. This other one is systematic bias, which are sometimes defined as barriers maintained by institutions such as police departments or police conduct. And to me, there's always at least two factors in systematic biases in an organization. What are the biases or experiences of the individual, say police officer, and what are the biases that are exemplified or encouraged or tolerated at the institutional level. Systematic biases are important because arguably maybe they occur in our court system or in our jury selection process. Getting back to our requirements for this course, to touch upon all of the required elements, sort of like if you write a good response to a law school exam, you touch upon the elements if they apply to a particular fact pattern. So getting back to our jury instructions, or my jury instructions of the state bar requirement, requires the addressing of the topic above, and more importantly, the effect of bias in people accessing and interacting with the legal system. And so let's consider the forms of bias in the selection of jurors and how jurors may treat or be treated by other jurors in deliberations. Getting back to the impact of implicit, explicit bias in the legal system. Something that happened, that phrase I don't like, ripped out of today's headlines. That's a marketing maneuver, but this is something that I sort of feel directly, something that happened just a few months ago in July of 2022. And this story it's typical. It's not really special or unique to San Rafael, but for some reason it resonates with me, just being so physically close to this. Just a few miles from my office, a group of Hispanic males that were gardeners were sitting in a deserted industrial area of San Rafael. They were drinking some beer after a day of work out of beer cans. The location was selected by them as being out of the way. They didn't want to stay in their, do their relaxing near their apartments, sort of in the canal area, because in the past they've been accused of making too much noise. So they sort of went out of their way to not be a problem to others. So they're out there sort of in this industrial zone, and there's really no housing, no one around. And these two San Rafael police officers arrive, and one of the gentlemen, the well-known gardener, was asked, he was standing up and he was asked to sit down and provide identification. And then he stood up in order to reach into his front pocket, because it was difficult for him to reach into his front pocket, pull out his identification. And what was really interesting and kind of sad here is that the female officer spoke very fluent Espanol, communicated with them in Spanish. And then the larger white police officer, and this is all on the video on the links above, but again, this is not a unique story, took umbrage to him standing up. The gardener explained, well, I can't really reach into my pocket if I'm sitting down. And this other larger white police officer saw fit to break the gardener's nose, etc. So it's unfortunately a story that happens all over this country with different ethnicities, and we're not going to cover all of them here, but this is just one that resonated with me for maybe just due to proximity. And so I followed the story. And so the district attorney of Marin initially filed charges against the gardener for resisting arrest based upon the police reports. So here we have a district attorney having a bias to believe the written reports written by police officers. It makes sense because at some level, we do sort of prejudge to sort of filter, and does the DA, are they geared up to read everything and to investigate before filing charges? I think they should be, but I do understand the physics of what happened here. But then later, the district attorney's office, upon review of the police body cam footage, which has now gone viral, the charges were dropped. So this is very significant. So through social media, um, it's sort of interesting how through social media it has bad sides and good sides. The good side is sort of like Gutenberg's printing press. Information is more freely available to us. So I think someone videoed this, went viral. The DA looked at the body cam footage, and sure enough, it shows what it shows. And the links above show this. And so to me, this is a sad story, an example of systematic bias. The institution of the police department, through one or two officers that I'm not saying are representative of the group as whole, because that would be me exerting some improper bias by judging a whole police department by the actions of two. But the institution police department obviously treated the gardener as if the gardener would not be able to exert his legal rights. So that's my conclusion. Or I mean, who knows? We'll never know what went through the head of these officers. But to me, I just look at it as, you know, back in the day, not that long ago, things would happen. Body cam footage wasn't available. Not everyone had a cell phone. It could instantly post on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter and kind of show the world what is going on. So my wild guess is that the officers involved just thought they could do carte blanche. Maybe they had some entitlement theories going on in their heads. Who knows? And that's a great form of discussion. And I'd love to talk to the officers about that. That's never going to happen. But I'm just generally curious as to what were they thinking when this happened. And maybe they don't even know themselves. Maybe they just figure, hey, we're in this area that's pretty much in the middle of nowhere. We've got this Hispanic group, 3 or 4, who are sort of laughing about having their ID taken for drinking a beer, which seems pretty innocuous, considering people enjoy marijuana in public in faraway places, seemingly without problems. And so what's also interesting here is that the district attorney's office, and not to point out the Marin County office as being particularly unique, initially continued the systematic bias by filing charges based solely upon the police report without any further initial investigation. Again, this is sort of stunning to me. Hopefully every district attorney's office is going to change their practice and review body cam footage and do what we sort of call due diligence. And in federal court, we call this our Rule 11 duty to investigate before filing a lawsuit. So maybe we all need to think about our Rule 11 duties to investigate before making a lot of decisions that are any decision that's going to affect the life of someone else. And what's really sad here, not that it's a pity party, but the gardener was held in jail for a significant amount of time, I think over a month or so. So this is a good example of arguably what is systematic bias in the legal system exerted through a particular police department on a particular day. But again, I consider the police department and our district attorney's office as part of our legal system, and hence the idea of examining systematic or institutional bias is very relevant. And I'm really glad that our State Bar of California has required this to be a required subject for this type of presentation. So let's talk about the impact of implicit, explicit, and systematic bias in the legal system. Let's think about this San Rafael Police Department incident. And I'm going to talk about why this is so personal to me. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I was over at what I call Miss Home Depot buying something, and there is something going on, and there was about 4 police cars there and a fire truck, and they blocked my way out. And I asked a police officer to let me through, and they didn't for quite some time. And one said they would, and the other interrupted, and finally another police person standing there finally let me out. And I, based on knowing about this, I did not exert a sense of entitlement or assertiveness to have them move their car. So this has sort of affected me personally, just being careful with the San Rafael Police Department, and also seeing how some of them really didn't give a rip that they were blocking me until there's about 6 officers there just standing around talking. And finally, one of the older officers came by and moved the car and let me go and apologized for the delay. So on a personal level, this sort of affects me, talking to police officers, and thinking, I guess I'm going to wait here for about a half hour, which I did, but I don't want to risk being a victim of systematic bias or just a systematic system of a police department that seems to be out of touch. So the relevance here is, what's the impact of this bias? For a lot of people, it's fear of reporting crime. And that also dovetails into a fear of a person's immigration status, fear of a police department, which I'm sad to say I have a little fear of the San Rafael Police Department, fear of a district attorney's office not seriously investigating allegations before filing charges, and arguably a devastating and long-standing breakdown of our legal system. And for that larger platitude, and we just sort of stand back from San Rafael, Marin County, and look at this country as a whole, and look at the police misconduct, prosecution misconduct, how a lot of people are getting out of jail due to DNA evidence, and various amazing entities, Project Innocence for one, that work hard to get people who are wrongfully incarcerated. So a lot of that has to do with bias, with laziness, with presuming that a person who's been in jail a couple of times, well, they probably did something, let's throw them back. So this is an important area for all of us to think about with respect to our own actions or inactions. Personally, as lawyers in a large firm or small firm, the impact of biases, let's consider this in our client intake at a law firm or its socioeconomic status. I have found I have a fair amount of contact with large law firms in my practice for whatever reasons we don't have to get into. And I find them to be very fair, learned in client intake. And I have never seen any improper bias. If people can pass a background check, they do check things, pay the retainer, they're taken on. And I find the large law firms zealously representing clients of any ethnicity, any group, etc. And I think a lot of large law firms hire very learned students out of law schools who are very well enlightened. Also, in the bias regarding ethnicity, in the smaller firms, there may be a feeling that they have an inability to pay for legal services, but through our wonderful rules of having trust accounts and managing our trust accounts very carefully, people can either make the retainer or not. And so we can disabuse ourselves of the socioeconomic bias in our client intake. Another really interesting category of bias, which is very relevant because we're having our November elections here pretty soon during the taping of this, is what's known as the halo effect. There's a really good story here about Warren Harding and beyond around 1920. He was a president from about 21 to 23. His term was cut short. He expired prematurely locally here at the Fairmont Hospital in San Francisco. But the halo effect, also referred to as halo error, is a type of cognitive bias in which our perception of someone may be positively influenced in our opinions of a person's other traits. And a common example is noted in Warren Harding And it's stated that he, quote, looked like a president, and there's a picture here of him on the slide, tall, handsome, and charismatic. But unfortunately, according to many historians, of course, historians are now differing on their opinions. I don't know if anyone here enjoys the historical studies of presidents, and he was a president about 100 years ago. But many historians rank him as near the very bottom of our list of presidents, plagued by a scandal-ridden term. And as popular author Malcolm Gladwell notes in his book Blink, Harding was elected because people looked at him and, quote, jumped to the unwarranted opinion that he was a man of courage, intelligence, and integrity, but they didn't dig below the surface, unquote. And basically the fact that he looked the part, spoke well, was enough. And people liked him and concluded that he has some of the attributes worthy of a presidential role. So this halo effect, it's really interesting, and I think it happened. It's sort of analogous to the sort of the beauty effect, but in electing presidents or people of public office. I think a lot of us are unduly prejudiced or biased on the pictures of a candidate, and don't look back and see, or look deeper and see what are the person's qualifications. And the halo effect, getting back to how this affects the legal profession, may play out in a trial. For example, a charismatic attorney or a powerful judge or dynamic jurors or the parties themselves may be able to exert more power or influence that is fair or accurate with respect to their achievement or qualifications or the facts of a case based upon their perception as being charismatic, good looking, tall, and being, quote, pleasing to the eye, at least pleasing in today's perception of beauty. And an interesting juxtaposition is we have Abraham Lincoln. I'll spare you a picture here, but you know, he in the 1860s, the Civil War time, before we had mass media, he was considered not a terribly good-looking person, but history has treated him pretty well. So the halo effect, it plays out in our society, but also in our legal system, as I just described, at trials with the attorneys and judges. And it's something to ponder and for us to be aware of and to think about in making decisions. So I think the value of a presentation like this is to pull out these different effects that we may not think about, whether they're hidden or overt, and to ponder them and to disabuse ourselves of these biases so that we can judge each person or each set of facts or each case by the facts presented that are relevant to that particular instance. So let's go back to actionable steps licensees can take to recognize and address their own implicit biases. And that sentence comes out of the California rules for this presentation of elements to discuss. So what tools do we have to recognize our own implicit biases? That's a great question. And there are anonymous online tests that we can take to recognize our own biases. And I've taken some of these tests. And what's interesting, as attorneys, I'm going to say most of us are gifted test takers. Maybe that's a bias. But I mean, to get into law school, you got to do well. And the LSAT, at least we had to. Generally, we're pretty good at standardized tests. If I get some email on that, that's fine. But that's just my belief for what it's worth. So to me, as I took these tests, to me, thinking about the questions presented in the quizzes was more telling than the scores that I obtained, because as gifted test takers, we can see what the socially acceptable answer is versus our true internal answer. So for me, while I took these things, that I give my, even though it was just me, it was anonymous, did I give my true answer? Probably not. I probably felt some internal pressure to sort of see what biases were being looked for here and to give the socially acceptable answer. So I scored what I scored But to me, the value of all of us taking these tests was to slow down and to think about the issue. And to think about the issue, that's the most helpful part of the quizzes, or for us to recognize our own biases and to address them. Actionable steps licensees or attorneys can take to recognize and address their own implicit biases continued here. How do we change the narrative in our mind after we now recognize a bias? Many of us are active participants in social media, especially due to being locked down from COVID. Take a look at who you follow and or interact with on social media. And what's interesting here, I'm sure all of us saw the Netflix show about the general theory about the dangers of social media and how we get what we get more of what we click on. So if we're interested in some slightly conspiracy theory, before we know it, we're reading media that says the moon is made of cheese, something ridiculous. So an actionable step is to take a look at who you follow or interact with in social media, because that's going to present more confirmation bias, giving you more information that's consistent with what you're interacting with. And then to the extent that we get out into the physical world, another actionable step in dealing with our own biases is to spend time with people of all backgrounds. And there's valid social science evidence to show that we will quickly adapt. So what does that mean in plain English? It means this is the grim reality for a lot of us. We work, we push the mouse, we bill our hours or do our flat fee projects. If we're good, if we're diligent, maybe we go walk a little bit, we go home and eat dinner, watch Netflix, go to bed. Okay, not proud of it, but that's the reality for many of us. So what this is saying is get out into the real world, which is difficult because we're still sort of a little held back from COVID, even though it's almost 2023, to get out and meet the people of all backgrounds. And what is the valid social science that shows that we will adapt quickly? The valid social science is that we become comfortable with just simply people who were around. And we'll talk about that later when we talk about the robbers social experiment in the 1950s. Here's another troublesome aspect of implicit bias, and it's also prevalent but seldom acknowledged. It's ageism. And one definition is that ageism is a prejudice or discrimination on the grounds of a person's perceived age, despite the fact that older employees are often the most knowledgeable and experienced members of the workforce. They are often overlooked in favor of younger, less experienced workers. The World Health Organization, or WHO, defines ageism as follows. Ageism refers to the stereotypes of how we think, prejudice, how we feel, and discrimination, how we act towards others or oneself based upon age. So let's unpack that for a second. Ageism stereotypes how we think, how we feel, and how we act toward others or ourselves based on age. I like this definition because it's pretty comprehensive. And maybe you pause this right now and just sort of think about how we think, how we feel, how we act toward others and ourselves based on age. And to me, this is really significant in that unless we expire like Harding in a hotel room in San Francisco, we're going to get older and we're all going to experience this. So the World Health Organization recommends 3 strategies to reduce or eliminate ageism. Policy and law can address discrimination and inequality on the basis of age and protect human rights of everyone, everywhere. Educational activities can enhance empathy, dispel miscommunication, misperceptions about different age groups, and reduce prejudice by providing accurate information and counter stereotypical examples. And for me, that's going to be, this may sound bad, but giving a shout out to older people who are running amazing social media campaigns, older people like me who still like to build their own computers, that's considered a young person's game, and mature people doing things that you typically associate with the younger crowd. And I think that's to be celebrated, exemplified, and advertised, because it helps. It's a countermeasure to deal with these stereotypical ideas that many of us think, feel, and act upon. And also a great action item is intergenerational interventions, which bring together people of different generations, can help intergroup prejudice and stereotypes. So this means including people of all ages on various teams and meetings. Age discrimination in the Employment Act, or ADEA, forbids age discrimination against people who are aged 40 or older. I call it 40 or better. Just like in the patent office, we can get patents examined more quickly if any of the inventors or co-inventors are aged 65 or better, as I phrase it to my mature clients, and they appreciate that, that phrase. The Act does not protect workers under the age of 40, although some states have laws that protect younger workers from age discrimination. And here's a link that goes into greater detail of that. Ageism in the job search. This is an interesting area. I know many lawyers who are 50 years or better who have firms that fold, etc. And I hear from them, they're having trouble getting employment with new employers. And AARP seems to confirm this research, that there is a bias against older people in finding new employment. Ageism has become so persuasive that older workers believe it has compromised the job search process. They may try, older workers will never enjoy extended careers if companies don't give them a chance to prove themselves. It should be asked why businesses across numerous industries don't adjust their policies to account for age discrimination. And I think the same could be said at law firms and maybe society at large. Maybe clients don't want to hire older lawyers as house counsel or hire them as solo practitioners to help them with their legal issues. So this is sort of a societal issue that bears examination. Examples of age discrimination and bias in the workplace: older, less qualified employers receive bigger projects and opportunities. Older, more qualified applicants get passed over for promotions without clear reasonings. Older employers are just unevenly laid off. I'm going to skip through, we're about out of time here, and I'm going to skip through what does age discrimination look like in the law office environment. That's something that's really interesting, but we're not going to have time to go through that. But here's a good action item that I'm going to end on, and the rest of the slides I think you can review later if you're interested. Is here are a few signs of age discrimination in the workplace. How do we recognize it in the workplace, whether it's a private firm, a company, a large law firm, small law firm? Learning opportunities are automatically offered to the younger employees, not older ones. This can include educational coursework, access to reimbursement for continuing education, professional and industry conference attendance, being looked over for past or challenging assignments. Discrimination can also be seen in that maybe the older people are given an unfair share of the unpleasant or tedious assignments, being left out of client meetings or client company activities. And there's sort of a unspoken assumption that you're not entitled to take time off, at least older people aren't, for family commitments, because presumably they don't have younger children at home. Further signs of workplace ageism include disparaging comments about age, This could be framed as subtle and playful, with others joking about a person's age, retirement plans, slow typing speed, gasp for breath walking upstairs, or it could be downright aggressive, people making comments or cornering comments that may attempt to pressure an older person to retire to free up a position for another professional. What is the best way to deal with ageism in the legal profession? Step one, don't assume that you or your workplace are 100% immune to age discrimination. Our brains work by relying upon established stereotypes for faster processing and decision-making, sort of like our hunter-gatherer slide earlier on. Learn to recognize your own thinking patterns, challenge your assumptions. If you see signs of ageism that aren't directed to you, don't distance yourself by thinking this could never happen to you. If you experience or perceive ageism in the workplace, if you worry about it as a possibility, one way to deal with that is to invest in your own continued growth and development, read and stay up to date on trends and best practices, and push yourself to do better every year. And this may sound counterintuitive, but get a mentor within your own current company or outside who's dedicated to supporting your success. This is counterintuitive because typically mentors are, by definition, older people. Here, it's just someone who's different or another person. Make a commitment to fighting stereotypes. Don't bring up your own age as a reason why your boss should take it easy on you. So here are things that are a little aggressive on my sport, but I'm telling people of my demographic and better, older, that the way to fight it is to don't use your age as a reason why you can't do something. Don't engage in self-pity talk about your age. Don't fall into the belief that your workplace owes you something. As lawyers, the only security we have is our ability to perform today. Nothing else matters, small firm, large firm. That's just the grim reality of it. And also, to me, project the same level of polish and professionalism as your younger colleagues. There's no reason you can't do your best to present yourself in the best light possible. So in other words, keep earning your wings as you did many years ago when you first entered the workforce or the profession. In summary, mature people need to stop making jokes about their age, present with the same polish and appearance as the younger workers, fight the stereotype of being uncomfortable with change and technology or being low on energy. And here, I'm going to end on this. Do not bore your coworkers with your war stories or tales of the past. No one wants to hear them. This is my pet peeve about lawyers, young, old. And I just notice it more with mature lawyers. They talk about their trials years ago and how things used to be, how they had to dictate with the cassette recorder. No one wants to hear it. Don't talk about the past. Be in the present. That's the best that we can do. I've moved through the presentation, talk about belongingness, something very important to us, and the robber's cave experiment, which says that you can take random people, put them in two different groups, and they will work together and dislike people in the other group without regard to exterior attributes. Thus, we can learn or unlearn our biases through group theory. I'm ending on this slide here of Nelson Mandela. How do we learn to hate? If we can learn to hate, we can be taught not to, we can be taught to love. Love comes more naturally. And the human heart is its opposite, meaning that through education, through exposure, through just spending time with people who are a bit different than us, we have this innate ability to bond, to enjoy our groups, include others in our groups, include people who we're familiar with. And that's the human heart. And Nelson Mandela says that very well in this slide. Thank you for listening to my views and information presented. I always look forward to your comments. Feel free to send me an email here. You can also reach me on LinkedIn. And I hope that I've made everyone or presented tools where we can all think about our own biases, our own prejudice, how we view the world, and how we see people as a whole. Thank you for sharing this journey with me.